alongside some of the darkness elsewhere. You have some pretty interesting and you know, encouraging developments, but also in our own lives, because we both take what happens in the world, as everyone here does, extremely seriously and personally, and feel acutely responsible for it. And so it can be tempting to get demoralized because change is hard, and even when one goes forward 2 steps, it can feel like it's 3 steps back. But this device, or this nudge that John has introduced to our lives, I really recommend it to all of you, that just to make yourself, at the end of the day, remember what are you grateful for that has happened in that day. That's it. And one of the many gifts John has given me.
Nudge, good choice of words.
Yes.
In the midst of everything that you each do, you both do, you have found time, and you have chosen to participate in Aurora. It is something that is close to the hearts of many people in this room, and you've joined that adventure, that process, that mission. Why?
Maybe I'll go first on that and begin by just saying how humbled I was and remain even to be associated with this initiative. I was flying in on the plane yesterday on Air France from Paris to Yerevan, and I just looked around the seats, which were filled by other members of the selection committee, including President Robinson, President Zedillo, Nobel Prize winner Shirin Ebadi, I mean, John. And I just thought, I literally did a prayer and I said, don't let this plane crash, please, please.
See what government service did to her?
Yeah, I literally did.
Broke her completely.
It was, I mean, just what these people have given, you know, to their communities and to the world. And so the fact that, you know, I got to sit next to Shirin Ebadi and ask her what she thought about Aung San Suu Kyi. Like, how often does that get to happen? That you get to ask one Nobel Prize winner what she thinks of another. So for me it was obvious, and Ruben and Nubar and Vartan are, I would say, if they had been put in charge of resolving the Syrian conflict or put in charge of Middle East peace, we wouldn't have the Syrian conflict or Middle East peace. Like, they are just the most persuasive people there are. So. But the answer is really deeper. I think this is a time when the darkness is very salient to people. When people in developed countries who are suffering some retreat when it comes to human rights or democratic values, as we are in the United States, there's a fair amount of self-pity. Oh, like, poor us. But then you meet people like the laureates, you know, someone who is advocating on behalf of the Rohingya, somebody who has harnessed her own personal experience to advocate on behalf of victims of sexual trafficking. You know, a Mexican friar who is working in a context in which people in his community are being disappeared, where parents just don't know where their children have gone. I mean, this is the most humbling, beautiful thing, and for us collectively to be doing anything to lift up what they are doing and the struggles they face. It not only, I hope, you know, can offer you know, some element of protection perhaps for them in societies where their lives are in danger, not only can publicize the causes and the values that they are dedicating their lives for, but can also put in perspective some of what we're dealing with. And so I'm just honored really to have this privilege.
And only a small footnote, I guess, just to say the combination that I think Aurora stands for, memory, gratitude, and action. You know, this potent cocktail really appealed, you know, my partner in all of this work and in the Aurora is George Clooney, and from when we first understood the vision of what, at that point, 100 Lives, and as it transitioned into Aurora, it was very, very compelling. And then you add on, and Samantha's already referenced it, you add on the sheer force of will that Nubar and Vartan and Ruben bring to this extraordinary endeavor. And I'd follow them over the cliff, wherever they want to go. We're signing up for life. And so it's a true, as Samantha said, a true honor to be part of this.
So long as we're on this side of the cliff for the time being, you guys are okay. Talk a little bit about the natural, permanent, it seems, conflict between the morals, the high morals, the passion, the intent, all of the things that drove you to do the work you do, and the reality of institutions, politics, entrenched interests. Talk about maybe the first time you actually came up against that and said, whoa, this isn't just about having the right values and going out there, but there's work to do between that and change. When did you first get slapped back?
We've been slapped back a lot, but
look up slap back in the dictionary.
Yeah, and there's like
It's
SP, JP. But you know, again, from the context of being so privileged, you know, for instance, I started my career in my early 20s. I sort of opened the newspaper, and there were pictures of emaciated men behind barbed wire in Europe 50 years after the Holocaust, and there were people who were in concentration camps in Europe, in Bosnia. And so I went there, tried to become an NGO worker for all the graduates out there. I was a liberal arts major, like many of you. Thus, I had no skills. But I had everything I needed to know, which is I had a heart that had, some texture to it, I guess, and I cared, and I went. I could write, which is something that I'm sure all of you have learned how to do. So I went and I became a journalist, and in the former Yugoslavia, became a war correspondent, and tried to be part of writing descriptions about what was happening that would move policymakers, to do something. And I felt, having written 1 million words on the ground in the former Yugoslavia over 2.5 years, when I got on the airplane and left, and I was very conscious that I was able to leave, unlike my Bosnian friends who were trapped and living under siege. So I had the privilege of being able to leave. But when I left and got on the plane, I felt completely defeated, as if we had written the story of Srebrenica, a massacre of 8,000 Muslim men and boys, and nothing had happened, and nothing would ever happen, is how I felt. And I went to law school, as one sometimes does when one feels blocked. And as I was driving, quite literally, onto campus in the end of August 1995, I got word on the radio that President Clinton finally moved after years of, trying to figure out what to do, and having tried basically everything short of the use of military force, had decided with NATO to intervene, according to UN resolutions and so forth. And within days of my starting law school, this genocide had been brought to an end. And so there's also a lesson in that, right? It's, when do you start and stop the clock? Right now, things aren't looking so good, for democracy around the world. If you look at Freedom House's indicators, democracy has been in decline, in a net number of countries over the course of the last decade. It's one of the biggest periods of decline, certainly the biggest period since the end of the Cold War. But having said that, if you'd asked that question a year ago, you'd have been really, really depressed. But now we have events in Armenia, events in Malaysia, events in Zimbabwe, events in the Gambia. That was actually in late 2016. Mm-hmm. But so alongside, what is so salient for so many of us is this longing that people have around the world, where they keep putting themselves on the line on behalf of their dignity and the dignity and lives of their children. And so I think it can, it's always important history can be a great source of consolation. In the United States right now, where our society is unfortunately very polarized, it's not a coincidence that people are, really reading more and watching more than they have in years about the Vietnam War. Ken Burns's and Lynn Novik's documentary came out, and people just devour this. And it was actually the case that they wanted to remember that there were worse times. And now with Bobby Kennedy, the anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's assassination and Martin Luther King's assassination, people are remembering, we have been much more divided even than today. We can come out of this, but we can only come out of it if each of us feels like an agent in that story.
John?
My sort of slapback story, we got so many of them, you just got to rifle through the card catalog and figure out. But go back 20 years. So I'm my mid-30s, and I'm working in a job in the White House. At the time, it was President Clinton. worked very closely with him on Africa issues, and he went on his longest trip of his entire 8-year presidency was to Africa. And we had this extraordinary trip. We had all these plans and these ideas and beautiful initiatives we were about to implement as soon as he got back. And within 2 or 3 weeks of his return to the United States, 2 of the largest wars in Africa broke out and just consumed the continent. The multi-state war in Congo, which President Robinson knows so well, and the war, which at the time was the deadliest in the world, between Ethiopia and Eritrea. A forgotten war now, but in the moment was quite, it was World War I style trench warfare on the border. And so experiencing that crushing sort of moment where all of the plans have to be set aside for and call the fire brigade, he generously deployed his former national security advisor, Anthony Lake, to be his special envoy. And I had the privilege of being Tony Lake's advisor. And the 2 of us spent the next 2.5 years, literally of our lives, 20 hours a day. By the way, Mr. Lake took $1 a year in salary. For 2.5 years, with an African partner from Algeria, because they were the chair at the time of the African Union. And we went back and forth between the president of Eritrea and the prime minister of Ethiopia, who never spoke during the entire time. And it was purely the dialogue by third party facilitated by Algeria and the United States, our little team. The Ethiopians were massing. They had a 7-to-1 battlefield advantage in terms of personnel. Anyone who knows military history knows that's a pretty big advantage with superior firepower. We're ready to march to the Red Sea. Was just preparing and starting the offensive when we finally got the signature by both sides stopping this war in its tracks. Not a shot was fired after the signing. For 18 years, because that was in 2000, for 18 years, the situation remained in place. They've never spoken to each other. Now the one Ethiopian prime minister passed away, another one came in. And the Cold War / Cold Peace remains exactly the way it was then, but no shots fired. And suddenly, 2 days ago, the Ethiopian government, which has undergone its own version of things that are happening here in Armenia, in terms of a democratic renewal, decided we're going to implement this deal. And I woke up to this news and I told Samantha, I wept. I didn't know I had this emotion inside of me. But you spend your life struggling for the things that you care about. Nobody would be in this room if you weren't similarly motivated to try to make the world better. You throw your heart and soul into things. And sometimes it works and most times it doesn't. And this time we were able to at least stop the worst things from happening. But then now, 18 years later, and we've been doing all this behind the scenes stuff for years and thinking that it was all a waste of time, suddenly we have a chance. The sun comes out. You never know. Aurora, the theme of Aurora.
That's a really good segue. You know, Aurora believes and focuses on the fact that individuals do good, and it is our collective responsibility to support good people doing good work. What you, John, seem to have chosen to do is the opposite. You've decided there are individuals who do a whole lot of bad. And your focus through the Enough Project, through Century, is to focus on those bad guys and try to stop what they do so that they don't have greater impact. So in either case, we're talking about individuals making a whole lot of change. Do these two approaches mesh? Does the Aurora approach of supporting the good support your work in really going after the bad guys?
Well, I think so. And there's a lot of things you could say about this. We could probably do a whole college course on this subject because there's just so much in what you've just said, and I don't even know which of the many tangents to pursue. But I would say that that at the core of everything that Samantha and I have done together and everything that I've done professionally, at least in the last 15, 20 years, has been rooted in the idea or the belief that at its core, any positive change that has occurred in the world has occurred in large part as a result of people's movements. When people come together, united around a vision, an idea, a principle, whatever it is, and are willing to work together for it. And I think about the opportunities I've had in my life to participate in these things. You know, when I was a young fella coming up and learning about how people make change, the anti-apartheid movement was in full swing. And for those younger folks in the audience, you know, as you know, there was this system of government in South Africa in which racial discrimination was codified in law. And there was a movement all around the world of people who had never been to South Africa, who probably didn't know any South Africans, but believed that that was wrong, and they worked tirelessly in coordination together, eventually to support the internal forces within South Africa for change. Then I had the chance a few years later to become aware of and then involved in another people's movement. It's called the Blood Diamonds movement. These wars, these horrible wars in West Africa, these countries were being ripped apart in large part because of greed. The extraordinary profit that could be made by selling diamonds to a world that didn't want to know where they came from. And this movement forced people to say, no, this is where this is coming from. This is what's happening to the children in the communities where you're getting your beautiful diamond rings and earrings and things like that. And it ultimately led to a treaty, an international treaty, that helped extinguish the profitability of war in those West African countries and helped change the equation internally so that the forces for peace outweighed the forces for war. And now you have functioning democracies in Liberia and Sierra Leone and the beginnings of change in Angola. This is extraordinary stuff. And I could go on and on about the changes. You know, there was a group of high school students, secondary school students, that Samantha and I were particularly supportive of for years, who locked on to this horrific conflict in northern Uganda, driven by a warlord named Joseph Kony and his insurgent group called the Lord's Resistance Army. And these young people couldn't accept that children, I mean, this had the highest rate of child abductions in the world. And young people around the world said, this is not right. We want to stand up. Why aren't our parents, why aren't our political leaders, why aren't our elected officials doing something about this? And they just advocated and made a nuisance of themselves. And over time, governments around the world began to take action. In fact, the Obama administration, during Samantha's time, was critical in coalescing an international coalition supporting the regional governments to change the situation. And now you had, I mean, I used to go to northern Uganda. Literally every single human being was displaced. And that's a nice euphemism for being homeless, for being driven homeless in the middle of a conflict. And everyone who's Armenian knows what that means. And so you had, you know, the entire third of Uganda, which was being considered a success story, completely homeless. And now today, go there, everybody's back. They're farming, they're trading, they're doing their stuff. Of course, there's all kinds of problems, but they have a chance because the world came together because some kids said this isn't right. I'm a massive believer in the power of the individual working together to make change.
And do you mind if I, Bill, because one of the things that I think is often missing from government work, or at least from U.S. government work, is an emphasis at the highest levels on individuals. And why is that? I mean, for very good reasons. You're trying to make, you have this great privilege, if you work for the United States government, to be working for, you know, what was the leader of the world until recently. And you had the, you know, when you can make, as people like to call it, the sort of aircraft carrier move on behalf, it's very hard to make it move. It's an aircraft carrier. But when you can make it move, the impact that it can have, but as a result, again, the emphasis tends to be on let's end a war, or you know, let's start a war, depending on who's in charge. But one of the things that I used to talk to my team about is often we go around and we promote human rights. That's great, and often we don't, but it's better when we do. But we would do better, I thought, in doing some of what John is just describing, or what you're alluding to in your question, which is in addition to promoting human rights generally, or LGBT rights generally, or women's rights generally, or minority rights generally, let's focus on very specific individuals, and let's set ourselves very real goals as it relates to those individuals. Because weirdly, you're in a cabinet meeting, you know, the highest level of the U.S. government, and sometimes, and John, I'm sure you had this experience too, it's not actually clear how you're going to measure success. There's a set of inputs, but it's not clear actually what the outcomes are that you're seeking. So we did this thing, very modest campaign, but China was hosting on the 20th anniversary of the Women's Summit from Beijing, was hosting basically an anniversary summit to celebrate all of the women that China had pulled out of poverty as part of one of the most incredible socioeconomic shifts that has happened in any country in the history of the world. Fine and deserved on that single axis. But China was celebrating that at the very time China was locking up, conducting an unprecedented crackdown within China generally on human rights, if not unprecedented, not since Mao had one seen, but very specifically on women, had rounded up women who were protesting sexual harassment and their lawyers who were actually trying to litigate their freedom within the Chinese justice system as it is evolving. So I just said, this is crazy. They're having this big summit that everybody's going to celebrate. I know how countries are at the UN. Countries tend to be reluctant in their DNA to criticize other countries, especially when the other country is China, whose economy is going to become the largest in the world, 10 or 15 years from now. And so it was clear that there was going to be this big celebration and almost no mention of the situation for women as it related to all forms of their human rights within China or within other countries. And so what we decided to do 20 days in advance of the summit is I and these young people on my team who were the real geniuses behind it, we launched a campaign called #FreeThe20. And we used social media to profile 20 women political prisoners around the world. I believe 4 of them or 5 of them were in China proper. Some were in Ethiopia, Uzbekistan, Egypt, some countries where it was very hard for me to get our embassy, the US embassy, to agree to be willing to profile a woman political prisoner from that country because the relations with the government were very sensitive. Virtually all embassies aren't thrilled about a campaign like this, but some more resistant than others. And every day for 20 days at the US mission to the UN, which is right across from the United Nations, we hung a portrait, a huge portrait of one of these amazing women whose voice was being silenced and whose voice thus was not making the kind of contribution it should be making and could be making within the community in question. I have to say that even having set this goal of free the 20, let's try to free the 20, I think when the first one of these women was freed from jail, I was completely shocked, which gives you some indicator of how low my expectations were, even from the standpoint of getting to represent President Obama and being the United States and hanging these portraits and being all gung-ho with my team. I was stunned. By the end of the campaign, 16 out of the 20 women were freed. And what's important about those individuals is that they stand for others, but also when freed, as President Robinson and all the great human rights crusaders in this room know, Maggie and others, when one voice is raised, that then has this cascading effect on communities. And so I actually think far more should be done emphasizing individuals. I also think it's obvious that we as citizens, not as necessarily as agents, but we respond, there's all kinds of social science that show that we respond much more robustly to the one than to the many. And whether that's Ali Kurdi, the young Syrian boy killed trying to flee Syria, the reaction to him and the money raised in the wake of that horrific image, 1 month hence, there were very similar photos, same beach, 6 children, and nowhere near the same impact, which is itself like beyond a tragedy, an abomination. But I think there's an insight in this and this is what I think the founders of Aurora are alert to, they are putting faces here on Mexican disappearances, on sexual trafficking, on the fate of a people who are not even recognized as a people in the case of the Rohingya. But if it's just causes and left to that level of abstraction, often fellow humans can't really lock in the way that they can when they're engaging real people.
And then there's the rest of the issue as far as individuals are concerned. Yesterday I was speaking with Supita Krishnan, one of the finalists this year, one of the 2018 Aurora finalists. And we were talking about how in her work in India, one of her greatest challenges is, well, one is advocacy and policy, the other is to change mindset. So that it is not okay to abduct and sexually violate children, women, or anybody else. So we're talking about individuals as agents, but we're also talking about this business of change being hard in the head. The work you do, each of you, is really focused more on the other end of the process, more on the changing policy end. So where do organizations like AURORA, like an American University of Armenia, where does civil society, the public sector generally come in to try to dovetail so that we in fact do get policy changed?
Well, I think that, politics, can be the prompt, or social movements can be the prompt. They're neither necessary nor sufficient for leadership on human rights and human dignity, but they're really helpful, especially in places where you don't see the necessary prioritization of an issue. And I think that, from having been an activist, John and I went in the reverse order. He was in the government and became an activist. I was an activist and went into government. I'm not sure which is worse or who has more psychological scars. But I think what George Clooney often says is, when he was active in the Darfur movement and in the work that he's continued to do on atrocity prevention or on refugees, he talks about, kind of putting money on the credit card or something, so that, in the case of George W. Bush in the wake of the Iraq War, he didn't have a lot of political capital to spend because the war was becoming, very unpopular. When George Clooney loaned his celebrity to the Darfur cause and, was a contributor along with Nick Kristof and John and many others in building this, unprecedented anti-genocide movement, by the way, which a lot of Armenian Americans were a part of, that meant that when George W. Bush went to Congress and wanted to expand funding for UN peacekeeping in Darfur, or transition an African force to a UN force, or spend literally billions of dollars on humanitarian aid, that constituency was there.
And John's really perfected that process of taking the celebrity along on, or partnering with the celebrity on causes that they too are passionate on, so that you get this sort of visibility and momentum.
But it doesn't, I'll let John answer that in just a sec, he is the master of it, but I guess all I was going to say is, it doesn't do away with the fact that when you're sitting in the Situation Room and you have a hard call, like Russia's bombing in Syria, half, as he was saying, about half the population of Syria has been displaced by monstrous attacks using weapons that we thought had been relegated to the dustbin of history. What do? You could have all the constituency in the world. That doesn't make that an easy call. And as you know from our inability to make the kind of difference we wanted to make on Syria, that is an issue that I don't think there's any issue that we spent more time on that we made less of a dent when it came to human life. So my point is simply, again, it's what you said at the beginning. If it's making its way to the highest level of government, it's making its way there for a reason, right? There are incommensurate issues on both sides, or it's just, John and I always talk about the toolbox. In Syria, we exhausted the toolbox short of U.S. military force, right? And probably if I did ask for a show of hands of how many people think we should have used force in Syria and how many don't, probably 50-50 or 60-40, I'm not sure in what direction, but the point is, sometimes you can use every tool in the toolbox short of the most coercive and most dangerous and most risky tool, and not make the kind of difference that you're desperate to make for people who have no one else. And that's what often happens, again, in high-level decision-making, you know, at least in the United States.
John, both the celebrity and the toolbox, your toolbox is different. You go after people's pockets, you go after the money trail. What's in your toolbox in order to change this sort of government violence, genocidal acts around the world?
Yeah, I mean, 30, working on these issues now for 35 years, and for the first 30, I was a dedicated, passionate advocate of the conventional tools of crisis response, what we normally respond to crises with. We send humanitarian assistance, have to, because you don't want people to starve. We often send peacekeeping troops because we want some measure of presence, international presence in these places. We send mediators to try to bridge differences between conflicting parties. And we talk about some measures of accountability that normally don't get implemented. And the end result of all these conventional activities is almost negligible on some of the worst conflicts in the world, particularly the ones in Africa, the ones that I've spent most of my life on. And so through sheer frustration and failure and watching the usual tools be unable to affect the calculations of people who are willing to commit genocide or mass atrocities, willing to use rape as a tool of war routinely, willing to abduct children routinely as part, willing to bomb villages, as Dr. Tom has seen over and over again in the Nuba Mountains, routinely. Like, unless you can influence the calculations of those people, you're not going to do that with humanitarian aid, peacekeeping forces, mediators, and vague discussions of accountability. And, you know, I come to that conclusion, whether it's right or wrong, with great sadness for 30 years down the toilet. And so then, what do you do? You look at, well, where is the vulnerable, how are those people vulnerable? People that are willing to commit those kinds of atrocities, to stay in power or gain power. Where are their vulnerabilities? And I found only one. And that is that the same people that are just doing most of the destroying in these countries are also looting these countries. Because in vast swaths of Africa where conflicts are some of the most endemic, these are very wealthy places. Gold and oil and diamonds and all kinds of minerals, as well as, of course, ivory. And so this looting machine gets constructed by the leaderships in these countries. They hijack the institutions of the state. This is such, to me, I didn't understand this fully until I really studied it. They literally capture state institutions so that police and military, instead of doing the job of securing the nation and protecting people, actually become an instrument of predatory behavior. The justice system, instead of adjudicating disputes, becomes an instrument of imposing the will of the leadership. Social services are bankrupted and used as a means of personal enrichment. And this money, these kleptocrats, as we call them, they don't put their money under their mattresses. They're putting it into the international financial system. Because they're buying villas, beautiful houses around the world. They're putting it into shell companies. They're stuffing their bank accounts using the international banking system as their getaway car. In US dollars for the most part. Now, when you commit a crime, a financial crime like money laundering, and you do it in US dollars, turns out the Treasury Department of the United States of America has jurisdiction in some way or shape or form over those transactions. And if the evidence is collected and found of those predicate crimes, those criminal offenses, and where the money goes and where it's stashed and where it's hidden and what it's buying and who the facilitators are, realtors, lawyers, accountants, and you find the money trail, You follow the money out of these war zones where people are dying by the thousands, and you follow them into the rich countries where they want to stash this money. It turns out that they can do a lot about that. It's just often we don't, and most of these tools were developed, particularly the anti-money laundering tools, in the aftermath of 9/11. So they're used mostly for counterterrorism purposes. So we said, why can't we use the counterterrorism mechanisms for human rights, for peace? No reason why you can't. So this is what we did. We created a team of asset chasers, if you will. People who follow the money. They come from Scotland Yard and the FBI and the United Nations and the CIA and the FBI, all these different entities that do asset chasing for a living and financial monitoring of financial transactions. They know how to do it. It's a whole subculture. I had no idea. And we've peeled away some of these people for much less money than they would make otherwise. And we're following this money trail out of these devastated countries into the international system, documenting the information, building dossiers, turning that information over to governments around the world. I'm leaving Armenia Monday to go to Kenya, where many of the kleptocrats in the worst war zone in the world, deadliest war zone in the world is East and Central Africa, by far since World War II. A lot of the banking, a lot of the illicit financial activity starts in Kenya. I'm going with the Undersecretary of the Treasury of the United States government to talk to the banks and the Kenyan government about what they can do to shut this stuff down. And if they don't, because now we're providing evidence of how they're facilitating these war crimes, there will be heavy, heavy fines against the banks. So what you do is you create a financial incentive. You make it in the interest of the banks to actually do the work, the moral work of stopping the looting of these states by war criminals. That's the theory of change. Now, how will it result? Well, we've seen when the United States and the international community working together has gotten serious about these things. When they wanted the Iran nuclear deal, and the Obama administration relentlessly ramped up with European allies, with Asian allies, ramped up slowly, I mean painfully, because no one wants to go along with this stuff at the beginning, but slowly, steadily put the screws to the leadership and their facilitators and their enablers, financial enablers in Iran, and created the deal. Now, you can argue about the deal and then what happened afterwards. The theory, the principle, the means by which it happened is a fascinating case study if you care about human rights and you care about peace, because that leverage, that's the word I was looking for. Leverage is what is missing most of the time when we advocate for human rights and when we advocate for peace. Isn't it in the interest of you, dictator X or government Y, to make peace with the opposite? Actually, it's not in their interest. They want to create the rule of law. They want to loot the state. They don't want to build institutions that would hold them accountable. So one means by which you give leverage to the internal forces for change in all these countries and the external movements and governments that are attempting to help support peace and human rights is to use these financial instruments, which are still being refined and deployed around the world today.
I'm going to ask a longish question. Everything you've said, John, makes me think of everything that we as Armenians do to prove to the world that, my God, this genocide happened, right? We print out New York Times articles from 100 years ago. We pull out old photos, and I'm constantly telling people my grandmother's story because somewhere we have this expectation that if enough people hear about it and if enough people understand it and believe it, that something will change. The other reality is that even when you don't have to convince anybody. Nobody has to convince Samantha Power that this is real. But when politics comes up against morals, passion, policy, issues like genocide, whether it's 100 years ago or this afternoon now, 100 places in this world, that at the end of the day, knowing that something is right and just is insufficient. Now, for somebody like me, Aurora gives me an out because I know that proving something to somebody is not my job in the world. I know it. enough people know it. My job is to make sure it doesn't keep happening, and I found a little window in which I can try to do this. Through listening to the stories of Father Thomas and Sunita and Mr. Cho, I know that I can do something as an Armenian for the same not to happen to someone else. That it isn't always necessarily through policy or by holding up all of the kinds of evidence we search for. Is there something else that should be in our toolkit so that for those for whom that is important, this formal recognition, that it come? Or do we continue to create our own new toolkits, like AURORA, and just push this forward?
Maybe I'll respond, certainly on the Armenian genocide recognition question. I mean, you know, this should never have been, and should never be controversial, right? It should never be, it certainly should never be a conflict among morals. Morality, history, facts are only on one side of this argument. And yet, you know, starting in the 1980s, you have a government, right, that has invested billions and billions of dollars and a lot of leverage as a member of NATO, leverage as previously at least a secular, you know, Muslim democracy. And that was a lot on one side of the leverage. So in that sense, other interests were implicated for leaders of Western countries, certainly in the United States, European countries. But, you know, to pull back from one litmus test, which is the great disappointment that many of you feel, and that I, as a member of the Obama administration, feel in the fact that President Obama did not formally recognize the genocide in the 8 years that he was in office. You know, something for which, you know, many, many people lobbied, outside, inside, and it didn't happen. And that's something that I know is very painful for people. It's certainly very painful for those of us who promised you that it would happen. But that is not the litmus test, or that is not at least the only litmus test for whether the efforts of the kind, Salpi, that you're describing, or the kind that Vartan and Ruben and Nubar and so many of you here have made to secure recognition. You can choose to focus on that on-off switch, or you could focus on the fact that it's completely embarrassing for US officials to kind of, you know, contort and, you know, dissemble and give these long answers because it's so obvious that there was a genocide and that they can't say it because a NATO member that is a partner on fighting terrorism is bullying them and blackmailing them. And bullying and blackmailing should never be rewarded, but no one who's listening to that happen has any question in their mind about what the facts are. You could focus on what Germany, which was an ally of a genocidal government at the time, has done, what France has done, what the Pope has done, and what, you know, so many states, I forget the latest number of states in the United States who comprise the United States, have done, what young people are learning. My young son, you know, who was born on Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, April 24th, not only do we light an extra candle for him every year, we light a candle for the Armenians, you know, in my house. And that's just, it's just fact, it's truth. And so Turkey can continue to bully and bulldoze and try to blackmail, and maybe it'll work, and maybe there'll be contingencies or interests or policies, as you put it. But this debate, you know, as a matter of historical record, has been settled because of the efforts of Armenians and the Armenian diaspora and Armenian descendants to tell the stories of what happened to their people, because of the documentation, the painstaking, excruciatingly painful, you know, efforts by survivors and their descendants to tell those stories, to be re-traumatized, like survivors of other violence have allowed themselves to have happened to them, simply for the sake of trying to make the world better. And in this case, the only way you make the world better is by respecting history and by recognizing facts. And the fact that it didn't happen again is a huge regret of mine. The fact that President Obama, that we did not do that while he was in office, but I wouldn't miss the larger picture here. This is not a debate that serious people take seriously.
John, the process that you go through in trying to communicate the urgency of what is happening, that this isn't, in our case it's history. This isn't history, what you're doing. This is violence that is being done to people today. What is the title of the book? By Yair Aron, the banality,
The banality of evil.
This is what happens. It happens. You see it on television and then you turn it off. The role of education and the role of media, are they your partners? Is there a gap here? There is in our case and in our history, but it seems to me there can't possibly be a gap today. It's contemporary, it's right here, it's right now. And yet, isn't there?
Well, I think, politicians and policymakers, just because something terrible is happening doesn't mean they're going to respond to it. You've got to painstakingly build that constituency, especially for these issues that aren't rising to national security, national interest considerations. And I think what's encouraging to me, and I was initially inspired by Samantha's first book, is that when there are people that come together around a particular issue and keep fighting, keep pounding, keep pushing the envelope, change can happen. And what we've tried to do in my own organizations is focus on particular constituencies. I mean, you don't have to have everyone be knowledgeable about a thing for something to happen. The key constituencies, in my view, are, of course, and you mentioned one of them, working with the media, trying to help them figure out what the unique stories are. I mean, much of my time is spent behind the scenes, not quoted, not in the story, but giving journalists a different angle, because they just want to, well, what is it that I can say about this that hasn't been said? All right, well, here's an interesting individual, here's an interesting story, here's an interesting place, and pitching them, in effect, on how they can cover the story for their publication or for their television station or radio station. So the media is a key one. Faith-based groups, I don't know what people's movement, popular movement that has had some impact in the world has not involved to some degree faith-based groups, usually working in concert with each other to the maximum extent possible. So we invest a lot of our time in building those relationships with faith leaders of multiple faiths to support constituency building. And then we, of course, the celebrities help just shine a spotlight occasionally on a particular place, recruit people to a cause. An interesting one poll after another shows that many people come to learn about a particular issue because somebody they follow in the news got interested in that, they found out about it, they learned about it, and they decided to keep working on it themselves. So that's, as Samantha says, necessary but not sufficient approach to the strategy. But the most important by far constituency, I believe, we can all have our viewpoints on our own readings of history, the most important constituency by far in driving change over time, over centuries, has been young people, has been students, student movements, participating in larger social movements. And so our organization invests in campus organizers. So, of course, 95% of the students on a particular campus might not know anything about some of the conflicts we're working on, but 5% do, and they're getting more and more engaged and more active. They go see their senator, their congressperson, they write letters to the editor and op-eds, they go knocking on doors to various policymakers, and they can make a difference. So you just got to figure out, the odds are always going to be stacked against you when you're trying to work on changing something. The reason why part of it is figuring out who is predisposed to having a heart for the things that you care about and then making common cause with those folks. And faith-based groups and students are the key drivers of change in anything I've ever been involved in.
Samantha, you teach. You did before government, and you're going to be teaching now. Are students asking different questions? Are they in a different place? Are they ready to listen to the urgency of what's out there?
Well, I'd say a couple things. First, when I went away to join then Senator Obama in his Senate office and then worked on his campaign, and then in the White House and at the UN, it ended up being a decade, if you add all that together. So it's been a decade since I've been in the classroom. I started again in September, and actually one of my classes is titled Making Change When Change is Hard. So it's exactly this set of questions that I think students are hungering to find historical examples of, tactics for. There's a huge amount of motivation, which I'll come back.
Aurora would be happy to contribute materials to this class.
Excellent, excellent. But my other class, I'm teaching 2 classes in the fall, was a very large lecture class at Harvard on U.S. foreign policy and human rights. And when I came back, I was very gung-ho about adapting this course now after a decade of being the President's Human Rights Advisor and then being, trying at least to be a voice for human rights in the cabinet and to speak from my experience at the UN. And everybody's, excited about that and basically teach what you want. But, is it possible that instead of just teaching U.S. foreign policy, that you might also think about China, draw on your experience at the UN, the EU. And this isn't because of Trump. It is actually because the world is more multipolar than it was when I left 10 years ago. It's just a different division of labor in the world, a different apportionment of political clout, and really different alignments. And so I'm really looking forward to teaching about contemporary crises and contemporary human rights challenges and things like the Syrian civil war, which go on in the United States, but to a truly multinational student body, several hundred students from all around the world, but also looking at each of those crises from the perspective of Vladimir Putin and President Xi and civil society actors, in Turkey, and really trying to diversify, because I think that's, in the world that we are in, where change comes from is also, or where opposition to change comes from is becoming much more complex. In terms of the students themselves, briefly, I find 2 kind of contradictory impulses in the students that I have encountered in the year that I've been back on campus, even though I haven't been teaching. The first is a great sense of alienation from institutions, which is unprecedented over the life of the decades in which these questions about institutions have been polled. The numbers have never been as dismal as they are now in the United States, whether that's Congress, the presidency, the press, lawyers, you name it. And even the one sort of sacred exception a year ago was the tech companies or Silicon Valley. And now, if you look at the polling, because of, the really, I think, unforgivable lapses in governance, or at best, lack of curiosity about the ways in which the platforms were being abused, they're standing also plummeting. So that is one phenomenon that is very worrying to me, and frankly something that I view my teaching and my writing and my voice, such as it is, as I want to use all of that to try to blunt that, because we need people to go into the Foreign Service and back into the State Department, because our best diplomats, the people who, on the rare occasions that I look good in my job at the UN, it was because I had these incredible linguists, Arabists, Chinese speakers, or people who really could dig into the North Korea issue, on some of the issues John mentioned, on sanctions and so forth. All of my best people have left the U.S. government, have left the diplomatic corps. The number of U.S. students taking the Foreign Service exam is now 1/3 of what it was when Barack Obama was president. That means that's going to be felt, in 15, 20 years when we're looking for our mid-level and our senior diplomats. So I view part of our cause really as reminding people what institutions can do. And it's a doom loop, right? If the talented young people aren't willing to comprise these institutions, aren't willing to place their trust in them, then the institutions will, further corrode and won't be worthy of our trust because we won't have the best people in them. So that's one impulse, which is a negative. On the other hand, my gosh, Emily's List, some of you know, it's an organization that helps women who are contemplating running for office. Emily's List has existed now, I think, for 33 years in the US. And its record for the number of women who had come forward seeking to run for office was set in 2016, and the record, I think, was 952 women had come forward. In 2017, the number was 25,000. That's the magnitude of increase in activation, and you see this in the elections also that have occurred just in the last few days. But you see it in the Parkland students who survived a horrific gun massacre. So you have the alienation from institutions and yet the activation over social causes and a willingness that I find really admirable and incredibly refreshing for them to make themselves vulnerable. When you throw your hat in the ring to run for office, that's a vulnerability. You're putting yourself out. It's an exposure. Your whole life in American politics is on display. I would say that also about young people in this country. Now that change is brewing, the question of whether that change works and produces democratic reform and really makes a dent in corruption and nepotism and the kinds of things that have driven people to the streets, that's that arc of history which is getting carved. It doesn't carve on its own. It carves because some set of individuals come in and decide to be part of that difficult, unseemly, slow, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back process. Like it's only, the arc of history bends only when people bend it, and I very much agree with John that whether we can pull people into these causes in a sustained way, because, will they be there when it doesn't work the first time around, the second time around? That's going to be the measure of whether this mass activation, which is happening not only in the United States but all around the world, whether that's something that, again, is going to make the difference.
You had said at Stanford recently, take heart. History shows us that it is lots of small actions taken together that produce social change. And I was thinking that had I read this and had we been doing this 2 months ago here in Armenia, I would have said, you know what, it sounds a whole lot like a small country consolation, it's okay, it's going to be slow, don't worry about it. Given everything that's happened in Armenia over this last month, I tend to think that what you are saying, including what you said earlier, John, about, often what you do is invisible, right? Often this happens hard, but it's invisible. And so on the one hand, we have to take solace from the fact that something is happening that we're not seeing. And on the other hand, we also have to take solace from the fact that it's okay. Even small, incremental change makes massive change. For that to happen, we need a bench. We need people younger than all of us ready to take on that mantle. Do you have young people working with you? Is it happening? Or really is the focus these days on domestic situations, whether in the US or whether in Armenia, that we're all looking inward and trying to fix what we've got first?
Unfortunately, it's a strange thing. You go around and try to raise money for the various causes that you work on. And we have not ever been able to raise any money for investing in the next generation. Maybe there's ways to do it, we just haven't figured it out. But we take from our existing resources and do it because it is so central to anyone's theory of change, anyone's attempt to try to make a difference. So that's why I mentioned earlier, we've invested in this whole infrastructure of campus organizers, where young people are recruited on the basis of their passion and interest about particular issues, and they get a series of trainings, and then they go back to their universities, and some of them are even in high school, and go and work there within their local environment to raise awareness and do all kinds of different things that are exciting to the young people in that environment that they create, that they innovate. We use all kinds of tools. You know, think about that film that came out in the last year, The Promise. You know, The Promise, and there was another movie that I was part of, actually my one role. I don't know how the hell it happened, but I ended up on the screen in one movie called The Good Lie. It bombed, of course, but it was a part.
If not for your cameo, it would have been, yeah.
Yeah, I sunk it. But these two movies, Promise and Good Lie, which didn't do well in the box office, have an interesting second life, because curriculums were, is that a word? Or curricula? Sorry, were developed, you know, to go along with the movie. So, and a whole teacher's guide. So any high school social studies teacher or history teacher or whatever, or secondary school or even in university, can take this and teach off of this film, The Promise or The Good Lie, or there's other ones that we're doing. Hotel Rwanda is a great example of, you know, learn about what happened in Rwanda and the genocide. And, you know, so whether you like the films or not, it's a springboard then to ask questions. And so, you know, the students love to watch these films, and they get it, whether they like them or they may not like them, but then they get, and then they dive into the questions and they go deeper and deeper and deeper. So there's all kinds of vehicles to recruit and to educate. And then I would like to say a second thing, which is mind-blowing to me. You know, I saw this study, I can't remember, I wish I could because it would be a great thing to read or cite, by some psychology journal. And they did a study of what drives people to get involved in a cause. And it was, they claimed, the largest study of its kind. And the third most cited reason why people got involved in a cause was because they saw some kind of advertisement or article that was interesting to them, and they got them interested enough that they learned about it and they decided to get involved. So that makes sense. The second most frequently cited reason why people would get involved in a particular cause, according to this study, was because, here we are, a celebrity that they followed got interested or was interested in that issue, they learned about it, and then they got involved in it. But by far, the most frequently cited reason people would get involved in a particular cause was because a friend or family member told them about it and asked them to get involved. Now, you think about each and every one of you in this room, particularly students, and the social media reach that you have. You know, whether you are on Twitter or Facebook or any of the other, Instagram, all these other things. And then, of course, if you take the next step and you're blogging, you're doing things like that. But the idea, backed by empirical evidence, if this major study is to be believed, that people get activated, for the most part, if somebody they know says, you know what, this is a compelling thing, here's why I care about it, can you join me in doing this, trying to do something about this together? The power that gives us. So we invest a lot of our resources in, and it's something you can't measure. You know, these foundations all want, you got to measure your impact. How do you measure that? I have no idea. But you got to plant the seeds everywhere and try to figure out, and some of them eventually will germinate.
Do you mind if I weigh in? Because it's such...
No, not just do I mind. You're concluding words on why students should roll up their sleeves.
Please. Okay, great. Well, just two associations. The first is that there is a film that was made in basically over the life of 2016 called The Final Year, which I inflicted on Ruben, and some of you may have seen. So The Final Year is a film that in which we in the Obama administration, the last year of the Obama administration, decided that we would grant behind the curtain access to a group of filmmakers. And the filmmaker who was doing it is someone I knew, Greg Barker, who some of you know, who had done incredibly important films on Rwanda. He had done a documentary about Sergio Vieira de Mello, about whom I wrote a documentary, the UN envoy Mary Robinson's successor as High Commissioner for Human Rights, who was killed in Baghdad. Just a really sort of soulful, you know, thoughtful, caring person, which is not true of everyone in necessarily who's going to come behind the curtain, right? So you're saying, okay, we trust this guy. But for the entire year in which HBO, because he was doing it for HBO, was following myself, John Kerry, President Obama, most importantly, Ben Rhodes, Susan Rice around, we were just like, oh, HBO again. It was a big pain. It was, because you're there and you're thinking, oh, did I say something that I'm going to regret for the rest of time? You try, because you're just yourself and you forget about the cameras. He's part of what he depicted, which I think is actually becomes sort of more important for as younger women get older and are having families and so forth. Part of what he depicted was the complete chaos of my home life as I tried to raise two small children who were 4 and 1 when I became UN ambassador, and deal with Syria chemical weapons and Armenian genocide recognition. So
chaos is an understatement.
Chaos is an understatement of my home life. But this is all on film, right? And so I just thought, oh, was like on the list of worst ideas. And then the ultimate worst idea within the worst idea was I decided on election night that I would invite the filmmakers to my election party. Right, no, that's not even the bad idea. The bad idea was I decided to invite all the women ambassadors at the UN, of whom there are only 37, we're only 37 out of 193 countries, so that we would have a celebratory, break the glass ceiling election party, not just us, but with Gloria Steinem and HBO. So the prize for worst idea, why am I going on like this? This is not my film, but I really recommend this film to people because, and especially to young people, because it just gives you a look behind the curtain at a time when institutions are being subjected to such criticism, including from the people who are in charge of the largest institutions. But it gives you just a look at the trying, the caring, the failing, the getting back up, and occasionally the making a difference of the kind that you hope to make. It doesn't end well. It's a little bit like a horror movie where everyone who watches the film knows that there's like a killer in the kitchen, and then all the characters are kind of like, going about their business and they have no idea what's about to happen. So there's that. But to John's point about film and the power of film, I think we who are thinking about the next generation have to be really creative. And this thing that we sort of regretted doing and wished we hadn't signed on to ends up being probably the most lasting catalyst. Second thing and last thing I'd say is that I'm writing a book which is called The Education of an Idealist, and the title may not do even though it's I know it sounds like a good title, it may not do the test of time because the expression a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality, right? The Education of an Idealist kind of suggests that once you get educated, you become more cynical. Whereas I think we're the opposite. We're probably more fired up and more believers in trying and in engaging and in educating and in activating than we ever have been, despite, again, the litany of failures that we could recite. But one thing I'm doing in the book that I would have never thought that I would do, in part because I find it very challenging to use the first person. I much prefer telling other people's stories. And I had trouble even, as John knows, when I was in therapy, I couldn't even use the first person in therapy often, which therapy doesn't really work if you don't use the first person. It's a joke, you can laugh. It's okay, I'm fine now, I'm married. It's all good. Anyway, but...
You're not exactly fine.
I'm not perfectly fine, but I'm okay. We're working on it. We're grateful for every day.
This is the conclusion, I promise you.
But one of the things that I write about in this book, in using the first person, in telling much more personal story than I ever imagined telling, is something that John invented, which is called the Bat Cave. And the Bat Cave is actually describes John's head and all the bats that are flying around at all times. And then it became the way I described my head. And one of the bats are the doubts that one has, right? When one is setting out, whether it's as a woman speaking up in a room of all men, or whether it's, as one of the new cabinet ministers here in Armenia, trying to push water uphill and, fight, sort of for, the kind of change that, may take generations to bring about, or, whether it's just someone who's like thinking to themselves, I know my cause is righteous, but I'm just not sure I can deal with the stigma, or that I can change the norm. Like the problems just feel so much bigger than me. And that's the Bat Cave is all those bats you know, kind of flying around. And one of the responsibilities I think we have in being privileged among all these, you know, giants in human rights to, you know, have the floor, but is to talk about those bats and to talk about those doubts, because I think part of what happens with young people is they experience their first defeat, you know, especially in the age of social media. They want their instant gratification. You know, it's not like that. You know, the bats are going to be there. You just got to push the bats away. You find yourself a John. You find your John. You know, your person who you can. Yeah, he's taken. I got mine. But I think that, you know, giving voice to what sets us back as individuals as well as communities ends up being enabling and helpful for people who are just starting out. Like, too often they read the result and not the challenges of the journey.
The trouble with live streaming a program is that you kind of really do have to stop when you said you're going to stop. So we're going to stop. I think this has been an amazing grouping of incredible people, in addition to the co-founders of the AURORA Initiative, the selection committee, the laureates, the finalists for this year, the 2 laureates from years past, Governor Keene from New Jersey, many of the AUA trustees, support group, students, of course, the American community here in Yerevan to greet our 2 U.S. guests. This has been quite an afternoon. Thank you very much. For those who at home missed it, please tell them this has been recorded. It will be up on the AURORA site. And the AURORA ceremony, the 2018 ceremony, begins tomorrow evening and continues through Sunday. And by Sunday evening, we will have an AURORA laureate for 2018. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of our guests for being here in Armenia. This means a great deal. And continue to follow AURORA's activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurora.